Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, we begin with the latest on Hurricane Milton, which plowed into Florida's west coast overnight as a Category 3 storm. Let's get the very latest track now with Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning, Nathan. The good news is Hurricane Milton is moving offshore. It's now located about 10 miles northeast of Cape Canaveral, moving off towards the northeast at about 18 miles an hour. It's now a Category 1 hurricane. Winds are 85 miles an hour. Recently, Marineland on the east coast of Florida reported sustained winds of 75 miles an hour, gusting to 83 miles an hour. All of the warnings on the west coast of Florida for tropical storms have been discontinued, as has the hurricane warning in West Florida. South Florida, we've seen all the warnings discontinued. Big problem now this morning is going to be winds on the east coast from Vero Beach to the Georgia border and a storm surge of 3 to 6 feet.
So now that it is moving offshore, Rob, should we expect relatively quick improvement to the weather in Florida?
Especially across West Florida this morning, Nathan, the winds there have diminished quite a bit. The big problem now is many areas had over 10 inches of rainfall from Milton overnight, so we've got residual freshwater flooding issues this morning in west and central Florida.
Okay, Rob, thank you. We're going to be checking back with Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn on Milton throughout the morning.
Well, Nathan, the storm has knocked out power to more than 3 million homes and businesses in Florida. It also shredded the roof of Tropicana Field in St. Petersburg, the home of Major League Baseball team Tampa Bay Rays. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is urging residents to be cautious.
Stay inside and stay off the roads. Floodwaters and rushing storm surge are very dangerous. And I would say that's even more so in spite of everything the state did to help these local communities hit by Helene remove a lot of debris.
And Florida Governor Ron DeSantis was speaking last night. Before the storm made a landfall, Enki Research estimated Milton could cause damages and losses in a range from $60 billion to $75 billion.
And Karen, former President Donald Trump had the storm victims in mind as he returned to the campaign trail last night in Pennsylvania.
We just pray for everybody. We want them all to be good, and we're going to be there hopefully soon, and we're going to help them rebuild and get it all back together. And we hope that God will keep them safe.
And the former president has overseas Americans in mind in his latest tax proposal. Trump says he wants to eliminate income taxes on Americans who live abroad. The move could cut IRS paperwork and potentially tax bills for roughly 9 million Americans who live in other countries. Those who earn up to $126,500 don't have to pay U.S. taxes, so the move could allow wealthy Americans to move to low-tax countries and avoid any obligations.
Well, Nathan, Donald Trump's opponent, Vice President Kamala Harris, also spoke about the hurricane, joining a briefing at the White House yesterday, saying people should listen to local officials.
Many of you I know are tough, and you've ridden out these hurricanes before. This one's going to be different. And so we ask you that by every measure, understand it's going to be more dangerous, more deadly, and more catastrophic.
Vice President Harris added that the Biden administration is sending thousands of federal officials to Florida to help in any way they can.
And Karen, before Hurricane Milton made landfall, Vice President Harris joined President Biden on his first call in weeks with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. They're trying to temper Israel's response to last week's missile attack from Iran. Bloomberg's Dan Williams has more from Jerusalem.
Israel is intent on retaliating for Iran's ballistic missile attack on it last week. The Americans have openly said that they would be in support of some kind of retaliation, although they've expressed misgivings about certain types of retaliation. Specifically, we hear retaliation against Iran's nuclear facilities or oil sector.
Bloomberg's Dan Williams reports the White House is urging Israel to limit its retaliation to military targets and impose new economic sanctions on Iran rather than going after sites that could disrupt the global economy.
Well, turning to the markets now, Nathan, and futures are lower this morning, a day after the S&P 500 notched its 44th record of the year, and ahead of this morning's key report on inflation. The Consumer Price Index is forecast to rise 0.1%, with the core up 0.2. Begin more with Bloomberg's Michael McKee.
Economists and investors expect no surprises from the latest report on consumer prices. Headline and core inflation once again rising 0.1 percentage point more slowly than the prior month. While that brings the annual headline rate down even closer to the Fed's 2% target, core inflation will remain above 3%. The Fed is getting there, but very slowly. Think of the report as something of a permission slip. As long as inflation keeps falling, the Fed has permission to move interest rates based on employment data. Michael McKee, Bloomberg Radio.
Okay, Mike, thank you. And as we await that report, a former Fed official is speaking out about the economy and the future of monetary policy. Former Kansas City Fed President Esther George says the central bank faces a delicate balancing act.
I've always been among those that believe this last mile can be the most difficult, because now you're trying to get from something in the neighborhood of 3% inflation to 2%. And over what period of time can you do that and still ensure that the public believes you will get back there, that those inflation expectations stay anchored? So I remain pretty focused on where we are with the current inflation dynamics.
Former Kansas City Fed President Esther George spoke with Bloomberg yesterday. The minutes from the Fed's September meeting show Chair Jay Powell is unlikely to get support for another big interest rate cut as long as the labor market holds up.
Well, Nathan, in company news this morning, Eli Lilly is wrapping up its legal campaign against companies that were temporarily allowed to make and sell copycat versions of its blockbuster weight loss drugs. The drug maker is sending hundreds of cease and desist letters to telehealth companies, pharmacies, and medical spas, demanding that they stop making, selling, and promoting products that mimic Lilly's Mounjaro and Zepbound. The FDA had deemed Lilly's drugs in short supply about 2 years ago, allowing compounding pharmacies to mass-produce copies, often sold through telehealth firms and weight loss spas. When the FDA removed the shortage designation earlier this month, compounders lost that permission.
In Europe this morning, Karen, shares of GSK are higher by 5.5%. The UK pharma company has agreed to pay as much as $2.2 billion to resolve about 80,000 U.S. court cases alleging that its old reflux medication Zantac was contaminated with a suspected carcinogen. GSK says settling the cases is not an admission of liability.
And it's time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. It is a positive for Ukraine in its war against Russia. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has signed an agreement with Croatia for desperately needed humanitarian aid. It happened at the Ukraine Southeast Europe Summit, where Zelensky warned leaders of the Balkans about what Russia could do after its invasion of Ukraine.
Russia must accept that Europe has borders, independent nations, and each nation had the right to choose its future.
Zelensky says he intends to present his victory plan to Western leaders this week, but a weekend meeting with President Biden has been postponed because of Hurricane Milton. Meanwhile, Russia is recruiting young African women to work at a factory producing drones for use in Ukraine amid a labor shortage. The Africans say they were duped, lured to Russia by a massive social media campaign that promised them free airfare and a work-study program. An airline pilot is dead after he went unconscious in flight. The plane made an emergency landing in New York. Turkish Airlines Flight 204 was flying from Seattle to Istanbul when the captain had what the FAA is calling a medical emergency, went unconscious, and died. Air traffic control.
Turkish Julie Kilo, just want to verify that the aircraft's being single piloted right now, or is there any other assistance in the cockpit?
Initially we had 3 pilots, but we lost our one of our captains.
The audio from liveatc.net. The captain died before the plane made an emergency landing in New York. A new startling study sheds light on sexual violence against children. UNICEF's Afruz Kaviani-Johnson says that the study shows 370 million girls have been raped or sexually assaulted before the age of 18.
It's not just something happening in a faraway place. It's something happening in every part of the world, in every community, almost in every neighborhood, if we really think about what these figures mean.
UNICEF's Afruz Kaviani-Johnson says tomorrow, October 11th, is Day of the Girl. There's a recall for almost 10 million meat and poultry products that may have listeria. The U.S. Department of Agriculture announced the recall, saying the Bruce Pack products out of Oklahoma included ready-to-eat items, including diced chicken breasts and top chicken white meat. They were produced from June 19th through October 8th. Global news 24 hours a day, and whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Karen.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you. Time now now for the Bloomberg Sports Update, brought to you by Tri-State Audi. Here's John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Could the World Series be a Subway Series? Playoff wins for the Mets and Yankees. Mets are in the League Championship Series. Yanks are one win away. Both rode clutch home runs for the Mets. It came sixth inning at Citi Field. They trailed the Phillies 1-0. 2-1
to Lindor. Now the pitch. Swinging a drive towards the gap in right center. It's pretty deep. It's back near the wall. It's gone. It's gone. Francisco Lindor. He may have just outdone himself. He has hit a grand slam into the Phillies bullpen in right center field. The Mets are leading by a score of 4-1.
WHSQ, that's Howie Rose. He's had quite a past week and a half calling all these dramatic home runs. Mets won 4-1, won the series 3-1 in the NLCS. They'll play the Dodgers or Padres. LA, without a healthy starting pitcher, used 8 relievers in an 8-0 win at San Diego to force a decisive Game 5 back in LA tomorrow. Yankees, Game 3 at Kansas City, tied 2-2, 8th inning.
Here's the 3-1 to Giancarlo. Swung on, a high fly to left. Back goes Melendez on the track. He's at the wall, and she's gone. A Stantonian home run. He drove a high fly deep left into the Yankee bullpen to give the Yankees a 3-2 lead.
On WFAN, 3-2 the final. Stanton had quite a night. The homer came after a single, a run-scoring double, and most surprisingly, a stolen base. Yanks up 2-1. Game 4 tonight in KC. The Detroit-Cleveland series has started with 3 shutouts. That hadn't happened in any series since 1905. Tigers have won the last 2, both by 3-0 scores. They're up 2-1. Speaking of shutouts, quite a season opener for the Rangers. A 6-0 romp in Pittsburgh. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports. Karen and Nathan.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager as we continue to track Hurricane Milton barreling across central Florida, snapping trees, power lines, construction cranes, bringing deadly storm surge to much of the state's Gulf Coast. President Biden is assuring Floridians he's got their back.
Once the storm hits, we're going to work with state officials to clear debris, restore power, and do it as fast as possible.
President Biden in the hours ahead of landfall. This morning, we are joined by Bloomberg News executive editor for energy and commodities, Will Kennedy. He's part of our team providing minute-by-minute updates on Milton on our top live blog, TLIV Go, on the Bloomberg terminal. Appreciate the time this morning, Will. What is the latest track on Milton, and do we have a sense of the extent of the damage?
The storm is now passed over Florida. It's headed out into the Atlantic, so it has wrought its destruction on Florida, but it's still dark. It won't get light in Florida for a couple of hours, so it's a little hard to assess exactly how bad the damage was. It was clearly severe. Some of the things that we do know is that when it hit, it was a Category 3 hurricane, which was a little less than had been feared, and the extent of the storm, the flooding, the storm surge, was perhaps lower than had been feared earlier on. So there's some hope that it may not be quite as destructive as people had feared, but it's still going to be bad. Right now, we know more than 3 million people in Florida are without power. We know that the baseball stadium in Tampa had its roof blown off. There are widespread pictures of flooding throughout the state, and rainfall has been really very heavy indeed across that belt, the storm tracked across central Florida. So we won't know until it gets light and we really see, but it is going to be a storm with really bad impacts.
But given what we do know so far, Will, in terms of the storm surge and the continuing flooding, the risk of continued flooding even after the storm passes, what could this mean in terms of the economic impact?
The economic impact of these storms will be are always big. You know, it closes down economic activity for some time. 3 million people without power for a start is a huge economic impact. And then there's a huge amount to be spent cleaning up. That's time consuming. Roads are blocked. People can't get to work. And that all takes time to sort out. And then there are very big insurance claims. Will this be a $100 billion storm? I don't think we know that yet, but clearly the economic impact and the economic losses will run into tens of billions of dollars. And this, of course, just comes after a couple of weeks after Hurricane Helene hit another part of Florida and then did enormous damage through its rainfall across swathes of the southeastern United States.
Glad you brought that up, because it raises the question that's been brought up time and time again about whether there is enough resources to handle the recovery from a 1-2 punch in Florida. Do we have a sense of whether there are the resources coming from the federal or state governments to recover from this storm?
Well, the trouble is this has become a real political football during the election campaign, as you know, and people arguing about whether the federal response is adequate. So it's often very hard to get a clear picture. I mean, clearly we heard from the president earlier in this segment that they will use the full resources of FEMA to help those impacted by the hurricane in Florida. And the governor of Florida has said similar things. So the resources will be there. Whether FEMA has the resources to deal with two such big hurricanes hot on the heels of each other is an important question that we'll know in the days ahead.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak, your morning podcast on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed by 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 92.9 in Boston, and nationwide on Sirius XM Channel 121.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, now with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto interfaces.
And don't forget to subscribe to Bloomberg News Now. It's the latest news whenever you want it, in 5 minutes or less. Search Bloomberg News Now on your favorite podcast platform to stay informed all day long. I'm Karen Moscow.
And I'm Nathan Hager. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.